Hello, for those of you who don't know me, I'm James. I'm a PhD student here at Sheffield. Mary's my supervisor. That's good. I'm very happy to welcome you to the final section of this conference. For those of you who are joining us now, we've had a great day so far, exploring numerous different aspects and perspectives on the Spanish Civil War. So I've really enjoyed it myself, and I hope you are too. We're now going to have our keynote lecture to finish the day from Mary Vincent, the head of history here at the University of Sheffield. As I'm sure you're all aware, Mary is internationally recognised as one of the most foremost academics of modern Spanish history. Her work has covered a range of aspects on the Second Republic, the Civil War and Franco's regime, focusing on ideas including Catholicism, masculinity, violence, and the relationship between the Spanish people and state. Mary has also taught here in Sheffield since 1988. Over this time, she's introduced countless students to the history of Spain, including myself, which started in second year, taking one of Mary's courses, as well as a specialist subject on the Civil War in third year. The range of topics that Mary has supervised for PhD students here at Sheffield is testament not only to the range of her own expertise in the field of modern Spanish history, but also her willingness to allow students to pursue their own interests and explore new ideas and approaches towards this complex and fascinating subject. So I'm very pleased to introduce Mary and a lecture entitled The Nature of Civil War, Spain as a Paradigm. Cheers.
Thank you very much, James. It's always customary on these occasions to thank the organisers, and this puts me in a position that I can only liken to that of the mother of the bride, given that, of course, the organisers are all Sheffield PhD students and 3 of them are my PhD students, but I do think you've done a really fantastic job, so thank you very much indeed. Okay, when James and Matt and Ruth asked me, and Ángela asked me to give this keynote lecture, you're really faced with 2 possibilities. You can either give a research paper, which is the easy option, or you can give what you might call a thought piece. When you're trying to draw some things together, you try to problematise some of the issues that come up regularly in reading and writing on the Spanish Civil War, and you try to kind of situate the topic in a wider context. I've gone for the latter option. I'm currently bitterly regretting it, but I do think that I think there may be something in this paper for everybody to disagree with, and that should at least give us a kind of rousing send-off at the end of what has really been a very, very interesting day. So what I want to use this lecture for is to situate the Spanish Civil War. I want to situate it in a particular period of European history. And a period of European history that is itself bookended by civil wars, from Finland in 1918, Russia 18 to 21, through Spain all the way up to Greece in 1944 to 1949. And this bookending is one of the reasons, though not I think the only reason why this whole period is sometimes referred to as the European Civil War, a trope that's actually particularly common currently in Spanish language writing. On this particular period. But civil war is obviously not a concept that is invented after the First World War. Civil war has a much longer and deeper history, which I think we need to look at in any kind of examination of civil wars. It's one that begins with the Greek city-states, and it is a concept you can generally find in every period of recorded history. And finally, I want to situate the Civil War, as many of the papers today have done, within the wider history of 20th century Spain. And I'm hoping, by doing this, it will reveal something about the nature of civil wars, what we mean when we talk about civil war, a phrase that we'll use, but often, I think, sometimes rather unreflectively. A historian, a theorist actually of classical Athens, Nicole Leroux, referred to civil war in the Athenian context as being the deep wound in the body of the city. And she was making the point that in classical times, and indeed since classical times, civil war has been seen as traumatic and difficult and hard to recover from. And in her book, which is actually about memory and silence in the recovery from civil wars, she argues that within the classical tradition, civil wars, which were of course common in classical Greece, could be recovered from by reuniting the polis, by reuniting the city and eschewing the language of victory for that of unanimity. And she argues, and has been argued since, that this recovery is posited on forgetting, a very present and indeed rather loaded term in the historiography of the Spanish Civil War. But this notion that you could forget the past, that you could forget a civil war, leads in the early modern period to an actual structured forgetting of civil wars. So, for example, the early modern civil wars, the English Civil War of the 1640s and the earlier French wars of religion, they not only both end with what are called, and genuinely are, acts of oblivion, in that they are pieces of legislation. They are not tacit agreements, but they are pieces of legislation. But that classical heritage, or that classical understanding, also provides a framework whereby during the war itself, it is possible to envisage a time when the war will be over and when it will be forgotten. So even during the actual civil wars, protagonists are talking the language of forgetting, because it is a way, or it will be a way, of recovering from those hostilities, recovering from that wound, that deep wound in the body of the city. It's obviously very interesting, and I've written about it in a different context, that you can have this idea of forgetting or of oblivion by means by which the past would be forgotten, by which of course they mean not talked about. You know, it clearly isn't forgotten, but not least when you pass an act of oblivion, you actually reified what has happened, you recall it every time you use the term. So you clearly don't, you haven't forgotten the past. It's a mechanism whereby you can envisage a future even during the period of hostility. Now obviously, and as we've talked about already today, the language of forgetting also surrounds the eventual aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, or perhaps better put, one of the aftermaths of the Spanish Civil War, with the Pacto del Olvido. But I really don't want to make much of that, because I actually think there's been a profound change between those early modern civil wars and the modern civil wars. Modern civil wars are still a deep wound in the body of the city. They're still a deep wound in the polis. But it is not the case that but while they are being fought, it is possible to imagine a time when they would be forgotten. It is clearly not the case in the Spanish Civil War that the protagonists are imagining a time of unanimity that will succeed the Civil War. Something has changed. They have different meanings. Civil War has different meanings and has become taken on a different nature. But the fact that it's still a deep and traumatic event is, I think, reflected in a different ways, not in imagining a forgetting, but in a reluctance to use the language of civil war, which is not actually confined to Spain, but all civil wars in modern Europe are characterised by a reluctance to speak the language of civil war, a reluctance, if you like, to admit the nature of what is actually taking place. And I think that reluctance patterns both the history of the Spanish Civil War and the historiography of the Spanish Civil War. That reluctance to speak the language of civil war indicates, I think, first of all, that civil war is not a neutral term. I think it's often used as such, or people assume that it is, but it's not seen as a neutral term by protagonists, hence I think in part the reluctance to actually use it. It's much easier to couch a civil war in terms of invasion or resistance or liberation. All, of course, which, as Dacia reminded us this morning, the language that's used in Spain. And it's also true that this is in itself an act of cultural violence. You deny your opponent a common nationality by making them into an enemy, an invader, or something that has to be resisted, and you then deny them a common humanity, which enables some of the ghastly episodes of violence that characterise Spain and other civil wars. But the language of invasion rather than language of civil wars also shows a reluctance to admit, first of all, the fact that this is a civil war and not an invasion, and then the actual nature of civil war, what that actually means, and that's a point that I'll come back to later in this paper. The other thing I think that the reluctance to use the term civil war shows in 20th century Europe is that the boundaries between civil war and intersocietal conflict are not always clear. The example that I'd use here is in the very odd term Franco-French War, which has become an established part of the historiography of occupied and Vichy France, particularly with regard to 1944, but which is quite clearly, it seems to me, a substitute for the term civil war. I mean, what is a Franco-French war if not a civil war? But the term civil war is not used, it is explicitly rejected, because France, of course, is a rare, not relatively, it is a rare example of a country that has a democratic form of governance throughout the interwar period, until you get to the moment of the German invasion. No. And that brings me on directly to a consideration of the period in which the Spanish Civil War occurred, and in which, for historians like me, it can only really be understood. And as I said, this idea of a European civil war that begins in 1917 and doesn't end until 1949 or so is now quite a familiar one, but it's not a defined one or an agreed one. It's most convincingly, actually, I think, applied to particular periods within that much broader period of history. 1943 to 5, I think, very clearly, or 1917 to 23. The period when most scholars agree introduced a new climate of political violence to Europe, both in terms of mobilisation and in terms of ideological cleavage in the aftermath of the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And the recent work that Robert Goworth and John Horn have been doing in Dublin, and which Jamie is a part of, has also paid a lot of attention to the paramilitarism that characterises the period 1917 to 1923, and that bridges and actually changes the idea of war and peace. It's not a simple transition from war to peace in 1918, and the experience of paramilitarism changes things thereafter. And there's general agreement that in the aftermath of 1917 to 18, there is both a new and ruthless model for the left in the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik state, and an experience of armed resistance for the counter-revolution, which is just as important, I think, in both a definite and an imaginative term. Okay, so this idea then of the European Civil War that characterises this period and which then changes Spain into a battle. You know, if this is a European Civil War that breaks out in the emergence or in the aftermath of World War I and is not settled until the aftermath of World War II, then Spain is an episode in that much broader fight. I don't think it is. I will say that now, and I'm not really convinced by the idea of a European Civil War, which seems to me to be used mainly rhetorically. It's used to reinforce the idea of ideological cleavage, the cleavage between left and right, and that then, in this framework, that becomes a structuring principle for all of European history in the interwar period. And you can do that. It works as a structuring principle for European history in this period. But we've already heard today how that, of course, it narrows the perspective. It makes everything into a very clear cleavage between two sides, and it also assumes an ideological impetus to most of the things that are happening in this period, which is not, I think, a position that actually bears close examination. It can be used hyperbolically, it can be used rhetorically, but I do not think you can use it as an actual characterisation of European history in this period, as Stanley Payne has recently been quite quick to point out, actually. Apart from anything else, Spain is the only civil war in this period that doesn't occur within a context of more generalised warfare. Russia, Finland, Hungary at the beginning of the period, Greece at the end of the period, these all occur within a much more generalised context of warfare. Spain is the one, Ireland you could look at too in a post-colonial context, but in Spain you actually have a civil war that breaks out within one country in that kind of classic model of civil wars. And I think this may account for what you might call Spain's paradigm status, that Spain is a civil war that has to be referred to in the literature on civil wars, certainly in the literature on modern or 20th century civil wars. Okay, I will come back to that. The point I want to make here is that the fact that Spain and thought in Ireland is the only civil war to break out in Europe in this period is actually really rather surprising, given the level of political violence that there is in this period, given the level of intersocietal conflict in this period, which of course sees a shift to dictatorship and a shift to violence as a norm of political behaviour. And this relationship between civil war and intersocietal violence, I think, bears much closer examination than it's generally received. To go back to the work that Robert Goworth and John Horn have been doing, they make the observation, then they're talking about the end of paramilitarism in 1923, which is generally true throughout Europe. And they suggest that one, either a reason for this or a consequence of it, is that the wider culture of violent rhetoric, uniform politics and street fighting has actually struck root beneath the apparent quiescence and return to the norms of peaceful politics. So you have, and this is of course is well known in inter-Europe, that between the peaceful democratic settlements, which you have actually in most of Europe after 1923, you nevertheless have a violent subculture, a violent subtext, a different political mode, if you like, a different way of engaging in politics. And it's also, of course, true that by this point, Mussolini has already seized power in Italy. So to talk about a kind of peaceful consensus after 1923 is a bit odd if you then start to look at what's going on in Italy. And Mussolini's seizure of power introduces both a new model for the right, just as the Bolsheviks have done for the left, and it also introduces hitherto unimagined violent levels of what has recently been called ordinary violence. In terms of both the attention that the fascist state pays to its citizens, its interest in their affairs and their movements and what they do, its recording of things, its surveillance, for want of a better word, of the citizens, and also the way in which fascism introduces new and ubiquitous forms of cultural and discursive violence. But as historians of Spain know very acutely, not least because we point it out all the time, Mussolini's Italy is, in terms of the Italian metropole, really not very violent at all. Certainly, it pales in comparison to Franco's Spain, which Spanish historians talk about a lot because other historians never do. If we're talking about direct violence, then Mussolini's Italy looks relatively mild. well, it doesn't just look it, it is relatively mild outside, of course, the colonial context. The violence of the Italian regime, the direct violence of the Italian regime is channeled into war. It's not channeled into terror. But we are nevertheless talking about a lurch in terms of violence as a mode of political operation, in terms of the cultural and discursive violence when you get Mussolini's rise to power. Yet no one will use the term civil war in relation to Italy, despite this level of intersocietal violence, until after 1943, when Italy's history becomes complicated even for Italians. And there's a similar point to be made about France. And Kevin Passmore's work, for example, has paid a great deal of attention to ideas of violence that are not about direct violence, to the discursive and rhetorical violence, the imagined violence that you get amongst uniform groups on the right in France with the mobilisation of the green shirts and so on. And those arguments can also be made with regard to the left. But again, and even though it is well recognised that there is intersocietal conflict and discord in France, including quite a lot of direct action, no one uses the term civil war until you get to 1944. And then, even then, they don't use it, of course, in France. The Franco-French War until you get to 1944. So there would appear to be a difference between intersocietal violence and civil war. And what I'd like to do now is to suggest what that might be. I'm going to put forward, and this really is kite flying, I'm going to suggest some key points whereby you might define a civil war as opposed to intersocietal violence, even in a period of history in which they are so confused. This is, I think, a very dangerous thing to do with political scientists in the room, particularly when you're married to one of them. But I am going to have a go. So what is civil war? What is the nature of civil war? I realise, looking back at this list that I drew up, that I've left off the most obvious point, which is that a civil war emerges within one country. It happens within a defined territory, within citizens who have more in common than they do that separates them in terms of language and kinship and common history and a shared experience. But most importantly, a civil war occurs at, and it represents, the point at which differences can no longer be resolved through normal means. And I actually think that's why it's so hard to use the language of civil war. I think that's why civil war is not a neutral term, because it represents a failure. It represents a failure of any kind of accommodation or consensus. It doesn't have to be democratic, but it means that the normal mechanisms of political life, how you resolve differences of whatever kind, no longer pertain, they no longer function. And it's at that point that you get a civil war. I also think, and I'm very aware with, and indeed I agree with what we heard this morning about the different groups and how the idea of two Spains is itself imposed. And we've come back to that in interesting ways, I think, this afternoon. But it does seem to me that a civil war has to be waged by two sides. That it isn't a kind of spiralling conflict or a mosaic of different groups. That might be embedded within it. But there has to be some kind of cleavage which is strong enough that people can identify themselves within those two sides. In Spain in 1936, I would say that is left and right. There are all kinds of different shades, and there are all kinds of groups who don't feel comfortable with that structuring. But I do think that when push comes to shove in the Civil War, you know which side you're on. It may not be a strong allegiance, it may be an unwilling allegiance, but there tends to be an alignment with one side or the other. And I think if there weren't, you wouldn't actually have a civil war. I think there is a sense in which it has to be waged by two sides, even despite the different and varied positions that exist before and within it. I'm also not saying that this is the same throughout the Civil War. And I think one of the real problems that we face in a lot of this writing about the Civil War is how to introduce ideas of progress or of change. A lot of these ideas, I think, are fundamentally static, as is that of left-right, as is that of cleavage, as is that of two sides in the Civil War. But they're not the same in July 36 as they are in April 1939. They've changed in all kinds of ways. I mean, it's quite familiar to say that they've hardened. You know, when people start dying, positions start hardening. They start the cleavage becomes deeper. I think we've heard some very interesting material today that suggests that's not always the case. The lived experience of war may actually have the opposite effect on individuals. But whatever happens, it isn't a state civil war. It progresses and it changes. The other thing I would say about civil wars is that they always involve a struggle for the future shape of the country. And in this sense, and by both sides, by all protagonists, the past is quite consciously written into the future, because both sides are envisaging a future for Spain that is not the same, in fact, diametrically opposed to the future the other side is envisaging for Spain. And that may be partly why they cast such a long shadow. Okay. So what I want to do now, and in the final part of this lecture, that I do recognise I'm going at a fairly breakneck speed, is to examine these claims, these characteristics of civil war, by looking at the Spanish Civil War within the wider history and historiography of 20th century Spain. And I'm going to start with an observation which is that I think, though there is no doubt that Spain fought a civil war, it is nevertheless very interesting how often that claim is actually denied in the writing about the Civil War, by which I mean that the actual nature of that internal conflict is not reflected in some of the most familiar things that we know about it. Okay, if a civil war occurs at the moment at which normal differences can no longer be resolved by normal means, then it's really not adequate to talk about the Civil War in terms of a coup d'etat. And Georgina cited, I thought, a really interesting example of that in her paper, with the citation that was a reference to the coup d'etat and its political and legal effects. And that seems to me to be a way of absolutely avoiding both the term civil war and a recognition of the nature of civil war. I'm not for a moment suggesting that there was not a coup d'etat in July 1936. That would be absurd. I'm also not denying that that started the Civil War. However, I do think that if there had not been a cleavage and this difficulty and the kind of end of politics by normal means, then you would have had either a failed coup d'etat, because it had been put down by the Republican regime, or you would have had a successful coup d'etat. But you didn't get either of those options. You got a civil war. And that is, of course, not immediately apparent. That becomes apparent quickly, but that becomes apparent. And I understand entirely why you have this emphasis on the coup d'etat, because it reinforces the point that the Popular Front government in July 1936 is a democratically elected government, and it is the legitimate government of Spain. And that's quite right. But I would see that almost as a normative point. That's about the ethics and the legitimacy of what is being done. I do think historians need to work with other frames of reference as well, which is to look at what I would regard as the kind of historical reality of the situation in July 1936. Because, of course, in the wake of that coup d'etat, as many people, and probably most people in this room, know, the Republican regime, it implodes, it collapses. And within 36 hours, it has gone through 3 cabinets. It is really struggling to get a concerted response. This is not an indication of a healthy state of affairs. It's a prime reason why you do actually get, I think, a civil war. I also think there's a real tension between the emphasis on the coup d'etat as the starting point for the Civil War and the later explanation of the Republican violence as taking place in the abeyance of the state. And this does seem to me a bit like trying to have it both ways. You have the coup d'etat, which is the illegitimate actions of a rebellious army against a legitimate government, which it is. You then have an outburst of revolutionary violence and indeed of revolution, which results in most of the deaths in the Spanish Civil War occurring during the first year of hostilities. Not all those deaths are attributable to the Republicans by any means, as Peter pointed out. More of them are carried out by the nationalists. But you still have a different momentum to the first year of the war from that of the other 2 years of the war. And this is classically explained by the Republican state being powerless to stop that revolutionary violence that it happens in the kind of abeyance or collapse of the state. But I find it very difficult to see how a democratically functioning government in July 1936 then immediately collapses to allow a revolution. I think there's a real problem there. Because logically it means that you have a regime that would have survived had it not been for the coup, but cannot be held responsible for the revolutionary violence once it has collapsed. Which I don't think you can square, actually, as an explanatory position. But I do think you can explain it historiographically. And I think that you get this kind of difficulty over, in my view, admitting that Spain is fighting a civil war from July 1936. By looking at the way the historiography has been so concerned with responsibilities. The notion of responsibilities, I mean, essentially, who is to blame? Whose fault is it that Spain erupts into civil war in 1936? That so structures the historiography above all of the Second Republic. You know, is it the left's fault? Is it the right's fault? And it is I'm putting it very crudely, but this concern with responsibilities has structured the historiography of the Second Republic pretty much since it collapsed, and it does seem to me that it still is. In my view, in English, the big protagonists are Paul Preston and Stanley Payne. But you can all add the Spanish historians, Spanish language historians as well. In my view, this has simply led to a dialogue of the deaf. I'm not sure anyone's changed their position as a result of these now well-rehearsed arguments, which have, of course, been played out in very public forum in the work of P.R. Moa and other popularists in Spain itself. But my real problem with the debate of responsibilities is I actually increasingly think the question is malposed. It matters deeply in an ethical sense who is responsible for the Civil War or which actions had which consequences. But in terms of our historical understanding of the Civil War, I'm increasingly not sure it's the right question to ask. I think we should really, I would suggest that we would understand more if we thought more about the nature of the conflict and how that has come about, how in July 1936 Spain is in the position that civil war is the consequence of a failed military coup, a failed and badly organised military coup. Okay, I'd like then very briefly to look at the legacy of the Civil War. There's no doubt that the Spanish Civil War was a long one, hence my favourite exam question, when did the Spanish Civil War end? Which I think several people in this room have actually answered. And a common response, particularly in the context of the historical memory debate, is either that it didn't end, or that it only ends after Franco's death. And there is clearly a sense in which it can only be addressed, or only addressed by certain constituencies after Franco's death. I'm not suggesting that at all. But in a historical rather than a discursive sense, again, I think this is quite hard to maintain, the war does end in April 1939. It ends not only because the fighting stops, because that could be ended simply by a military victory, but it is the case, actually, that Franco doesn't need to conquer the remaining Republican territory in April 1939. It implodes. The final territory of the Republican state is not conquered. They just walk in, and no resistance is offered. And this is a profound contrast to other historical examples from the period. And I do think that a civil war has to involve direct military action in the sense of resistance and attack. I think what it leaves is a legacy, and I think part of the legacy that it leaves is that of partisanship, which is what I'd like to talk about right in the last 5 minutes. Discursively, there is no doubt that the regime fights the Civil War until the end of the Franco regime fights the Civil War until the end of its life. There is also absolutely no doubt that Franco's regime is built on the material realities of a brutal military victory. There is no doubt at all that the Franco regime is imposed or that it is born in violence. It maintains the presence of this violence and certainly the cultural and structural violence throughout its existence, but it does not maintain the same levels of direct violence. The fighting stops in April 1939. There are, of course, guerrilla resistance groups in the mountains. They're picked off through the 1940s. And there is none significant left into the 1950s. But if, as is being done, you extend the Civil War all the way through the Franco regime, to argue that the violence of the Civil War is maintained throughout the regime, which is an increasingly common position, I think. I think that's also difficult, again, if we're maintaining the difference between this regime and Mussolini's regime. Because after the mid-1940s, the Franco regime does not have anything like the same levels of violence as have been employed in the period of terror or has it been employed during the Civil War. Political executions, for example, rise again in the crisis of the regime in the 60s and in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, but there is not the same pattern of violence or the same threat of violence throughout a really large swathe of the Francoist regime. What you do have, I think, is that idea of ordinary violence in the same way that you do in Mussolini's Italy. That never goes away. What you also have, and this will bring me back to points that were made in the first panel on exile this morning, is a multi-temporality. You know, this regime comes into existence before the Second World War, imposes massive and brutal terror during the period of the Second World War, survives the Second World War into the Cold War, and then is still there when you have the affluence and consumption of the 1950s and 60s. It's quite telling, I think, that in the 1930s, phalanges throw bottles of ink at figures of Stalin on Madrid cinema screens, and in the 1950s, they throw bottles of ink at Rita Hayworth on cinema screens in Madrid. this regime it exists through various different contexts. And though the discourse of civil war doesn't change, the meanings of that discourse can. There is a multi-temporality about the Franco regime, just as there is to, for example, the experience of exile. And I was very struck by one of Mary Path's comments about multi-temporality of the Republican exile, which is republicanism extended into space through displacement and hanging abroad. But within Spain, republicanism becomes multi-temporal because it's extended in time, because it survives through the Franco regime and into very different periods and very different contexts. And in these contexts, these ideas, Republican identities, they are reconstructed discursively, both by speech and by silence, and that happens primarily within the home, but it does happen within other safe spaces. This is the point that I mean about stasis. These meanings are not fixed. The Civil War doesn't mean the same thing in these different periods. Republican identities are not the same in these different periods, as indeed we've already heard. There isn't a single one Republican identity anyway. There's a complexity to political language, a complexity to these kinds of discursive constructions, which are too often lost, I think, by these simple impositions of terms. Even Gareth, the opening of the Way de los Caídos, as I'm sure you know, on the 1st of April 1959, with its triumphalist, highly conservative, traditional Catholic rhetoric, occurs after the bishops have been called to Rome for the Second Vatican Council, and it looks out of date even at the moment of its inauguration. You have this happens. Okay, so the final point that I want to make, because I have about 2 minutes by my watch, and this I'm not going to have time to explore this, but I do think that it is this legacy of partisanship which could be a very useful key to understanding the transition and the role that the past plays in the transition. Like Gareth, I'm not at all convinced about the Pacto del Olvido in a cultural sense. And I also agree with Dacia that the transition is fearful, but I don't think it's the fear of civil war. The conditions for civil war are just not there in Spain in the 1970s. It could have been a violent transition. It could certainly have been a less consensual, a less peaceful transition. It could have been a kind of Portuguese transition in all kinds of ways. But I do not think it's a civil war. And I also think that despite the regime's denial, the Francoist regime's denial of the fact, Spaniards know they have fought a civil war. They know they have had neighbours and friends and relations on the other side or on different who had different histories. I do not think I do not think it's unknown that Spain's been through a civil war, and I do, which makes, I think, much of the regime's rhetoric either unconvincing or understood in various and different ways. But what doesn't go away is that partisanship. What doesn't go away is that positioning between one side or the other. And it's that, I think, that has come out very clearly in those, in the historical memory debates and in the demand for the redress of the past, which we've heard about today. I prefer the term usable past to historical memory. I always have. I find it much easier to handle, and I also have a reasonable sense that I know what it means, and I'm not sure I do know what historical memory means, which may just reflect the complexity of the whole. But if you are having a usable past constructed under democracy, you have to have a memory or a collective narrative or sets of collective narratives that include the right rather than the left, as well as the left. A democracy cannot do what the Francoist regime did and exclude half of the nation. Any kind of construction during the transition and after the transition has to include the right as well as the left, and the right's past is the Francoist victory. And that's one of the real difficulties, I think, around these debates, both in the transition and today. And it's also, I think, one of the ways in which the Civil War has played out into that legacy of partisanship that I alluded to. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you, Mary, for that fascinating talk. We've got some time for some questions, which I'm sure there'll be many. So, I see a hand from at the back.
I don't know if you can hear me up front there.
Yeah, I can.
I'll try and speak louder. Thank you for the kite flying. I think it's great to indulge in that. I think it's fitting for a conference such as this. But I just wondered about two particular national scenarios and how they fitted into what I thought was an illuminating understanding of the Civil War. One, quite obviously and perhaps predictably, but also topically, is Syria. I think there's certainly more than two sides in Syria. The proliferation of groups and their various affiliations, I think, unless you are a scholar of that country or of that particular geographical region, I think is quite difficult to grasp. But also, I think it's a civil war, if it is a civil war, that has spilled well beyond its own borders, and there are incursions from neighbouring countries. So I wondered how that particular conflict fitted in with your understanding of the Civil War, and also, for example, the Colombian conflict. Since the violencia of the 1950s, some people have argued that this is indeed a civil war. Others have argued, I think, from a sort of a political or a peace-building perspective, this is indeed a conflicto armado interno de baja intensidad. I don't know whether that's the euphemism or not. An internal armed conflict of low intensity, which of course has been dragging on for more than 50 years. So I wondered, I'm not a specialist on either country, Syria or Colombia, but I wondered if those examples might be useful to take into account.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Actually, because well, you and I and several other people were at an event organised by the IBMT the other week in Manchester, and that idea of the Syrian conflict came up with much kind of indignation, actually, that it might be compared to the Spanish Civil War, which was one of the things that got me thinking about this idea of paradigms. And it is true. I know. I think I probably know even less about Syria than you do, but it's a which I don't mean rudely at all. I mean neither is an expert in the Middle East. But it does seem to me that if you take that kind of basic understanding that civil war happens when normal means are exhausted or no longer possible, then I think you could fit Syria into the same or similar kind of framework. I mean, you do, of course, have these myriad groups, but you also seem to have that sort of fundamental division, that language of us and them that we were talking about this morning. Colombia, where I'm quite sure you do know more than I do. Colombia, I suspect, is not quite the same, actually, in that there is still the potential for a workable state solution. And that might be the difference, but I'd be very hesitant saying anything more definite.
Yes.
There's a short story by a Sicilian novelist about the Spanish Civil War, and he has one of the characters say that civil wars are the only honest wars. Wars between states were organised by ruling classes. The working class and peasants fight against each other. But a civil war, especially Spain, is a class conflict.
Class war.
As you said, it's left and right. But I think we should sharpen it and say it's about class. It's about the working class, the peasantry, trying to overthrow the ruling class, especially in the early days, or up until the time that the anarchists and the boom were extinguished.
I wouldn't at all disagree that there are profound elements of class war in Spain, but I actually started working on Spain by looking at by looking at the Castilian peasantry, who are very poor but who fight for Franco, and I do think there are complexities there as well. But I would actually agree that Spain, though it is internationalised just as Syria is internationalised, and then that assumes different dimensions, I do agree that it is at heart an internal cleavage rather than a Second World War in miniature.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mary. It was very interesting. I was particularly interested in the distinction you drew between responsibility and the nature of events.
Mm.
And I wonder if that's too sharp a distinction, or whether a more interesting question is to see how the two interlink. I was thinking particularly of the work of Calibas on the logic of violence in the Civil War. He talks very much about this process that develops over time. And some of the key parts of that process seem to be to do with collapse of security, a desire for sovereignty, to rebuild sovereignty, and the need for the different groups to classify people in different ways, us and them, as you described it. And that seems very much to be a process which would respond to the nature of events, but it strikes me that what comes out of that process is the need to attribute responsibility in certain ways, either from the collapse of security or from the need to build this sovereign state that divides people into different groups, or particularly to classify people in certain ways. So rather than seeking to divorce the two, maybe it's more interesting to look at the interaction.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think that's a very interesting point, and like you, I do really rate that work. I think it's extremely interesting, and I think part of that is it does provide that kind of dynamic understanding of civil wars as well as it. I think my problem with the way in which the responsibility stuff at literature has played out is both that it's become so sharply polarised, which I don't find particularly helpful. Really, because the arguments I think tend to become circular, but because it's almost lost that. I think it can lose that kind of sense of process and quite quickly. But yeah, I do take that point.
Nothing.
Hey, thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask about this term, the usable past, because somebody else used it today. And for me, when I think of it, I think of Margaret Macmillan's uses and abuses of history. So if it's a usable past, isn't it also therefore an abusable past? And can you just say a little bit more about what you mean by usable past?
I'm quite sure that's true, though I think that's probably true of any of history. The understanding of usable past that I would refer to is the one that historians like Bob Muller have been working on for Germany, and that obviously where you've got that very you've got both the experience of defeat and you've got the experience of Nazism, you've got the experience of defeat, then the experience of denazification, and a very complex, very difficult history, and so that idea of the usable past is best worked through, as far as I know, in relation to German history. Where I find it useful is that I think it reinforces the point that these are about narratives in the present, which are of course related to the events of the past, but are not necessarily a memory of that past. They may be and they will relate to memories of that past, but it's much more a retelling, a reassembling of those narratives in the present, which is why I find the term easier to work with, but none of these terms are without difficulty.
Rosie?
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating and refreshing talk. Just thinking about the Syria and Colombia comparison, do you think you could add to the first thing of it's a conflict that can't be resolved through other means, but also you need both sides to have the capacity to get armed?
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Yes.
So in Syria, that's happened, and perhaps in Colombia, one side is so much more powerless than the other side and has no access to funding, arms, a power base, an administrative structure, a network, that this is why it's...
Yes. Yeah.
I think the same can be said about Mexico as well, maybe these are all...
Yes. And I think you can make that point historically as well. You know, if the Spanish Civil War really had been an army against a people, it would have been over an awful lot quicker. So yes, you have to have some kind of parity or of resource.
Great work.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And I just got a little bit of a problem with the pre-existence of the sites, because if we take the facts of the coup or the fake coup out of the picture, and when did those two sites started existed, and when the war started?
I think the only way of answering that is, I think, by a hypothetical. So, you know, if the coup had failed, what would have been the consequences of that? Would it have been, you know, would it have meant there was no civil war, or would it mean that the outbreak of civil war was delayed? And I don't, obviously I don't know the answer to that. Nobody knows the answer to that. It's an impossible question. But I do think it's worth posing. I do think it's worth posing, and that's really what I mean about thinking about the nature of civil war, what you might call the structural conditions for civil war, because they are there in Spain in 1936. The coup, it seems to me, is in many ways a catalyst.
We've got Gareth.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on that last point, when you were going through the list of examples of possible civil wars in the interwar period, I was reminded of a colleague of mine from Swansea who used to tell me that Austria had a civil war in 1934.
Yes.
Only lasted a few days, and I was not sure at the time how far I could push this, but I said to her, is that really a civil war? And certainly in their historiography it's considered a civil war. So I wondered how long a conflict has to last to become a civil war. Spain had its own revolt in 1934 and an earlier attempted coup in 1932, both of which failed. And some, as you know, some right-wing historians are trying to call 1934 the start of the Civil War.
Yes, but with no plausibility at all.
But just the last point you made about the importance of the foreign intervention, which turned this into a civil war rather than a failed coup. And you asked the hypothetical question, what would have happened had the coup not succeeded? Perhaps we would have seen an Austria, you know, we don't know, perhaps we would have seen the 1934 scenario in reverse, where, you know, there was some kind of repression of the right.
Yeah.
And we just don't know.
No. My understanding of the Austrian term, the Austrian Civil War of 1934, is that it's a bit like the Civil War in France, to refer to the Paris Commune, and it, you know, so it's about the crushing of Red Vienna, and I think there are quite difficult questions as to whether that is a civil war. The counter example might be the Finnish Civil War, which is a civil war, but is called by all kinds of names, which do not generally include the term civil war. In a way, it seems easier to use the term civil war if it's not a civil war, and much harder when it is. Danny has been.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to echo everybody else in saying what I'm very interested in the talk that was. I'd just like to ask about what I think was your last point. Apologies for paraphrasing, but any sort of functioning democracy in Spain would have to acknowledge the legitimacy of right-wing memory as well as left-wing memory. I was just wondering how that fits in with the political realities of Spain at the moment. I mean, it seems problematic, to say the least, to talk about a functioning democracy that would then sort of magnanimously recognise these two memories as equally valid in the current context. We've heard of a few people talking about it today, that the current political reality is still of a post-Franco, but not necessarily post-Francoist state, that in spite of the functioning of a liberal democracy in the country doesn't acknowledge the defeated in the same way that it acknowledges the victors. So I mean, how can that consciousness of a future sort of utopian functioning democracy impact upon the sort of priorities of people trying to fight for historical memory, for want of a better term?
Well, isn't it partly that there's so many things going on within the historical memory movement that, and the clearest of which, and a very important component of almost all public history campaigns, is for the redress of wrongs, for the redress of previous wrongs, and that's quite clear. But it does seem to me, as Georgina was talking about this morning, that when you get some things that are obvious fudges, like the kind of privatisation of memory and things, that seems to me to be almost to reflect the difficulty of that kind of accommodation. And I actually agree entirely with Georgina that had the right grasped this nettle earlier, then it would have been, it might have been much easier, but they didn't. And so you got this kind of avoidance of the past on the part of an important constituency, important number of Spanish citizens, and the kind of the tacit agreement at one stage when you can get democracy up and running, or the institutions of democracy up and running, which has left the legacy that you see currently. How you address that, I don't know. What that means for democracy in Spain, I'm sorry, I'm going to leave that to other people to answer. But I think it's a good point. I don't know the answer.
Yes, at the back.
Thanks for your talk. It's left me sort of thinking a lot, and all the more confused about what exactly is it, the Civil War. I mean, my conception of the Spanish Civil War, when you take into account the support Franco got from Hitler, Mussolini in terms of military support, makes me always feel it's inadequate to refer to Spain, what happened in Spain between 1936 to 1939 as a civil war, because it was a much wider thing than that. To me, it was a precursor to what happened in the Second World War, and just in a similar sort of vein, if people were thinking about Colombia, I mean, you can't necessarily conceive of what's happened over the last 50 years in Colombia as a civil war when you take into account the amount of US imperialist intervention that has occurred in Colombia. That broadens it out and takes it into a different framework, doesn't it?
It undoubtedly means that there are different, both that these are highly complex events and that there are different kind of levels and meanings at all stages. And I said there is no doubt that the Spanish Civil War was internationalised. But I would still maintain that at the heart of the Civil War there is a fundamental cleavage within Spain, which provides an opportunity for engagement by other powers, notably, of course, Germany and Italy. But in terms of the way in which that then plays out within Spain, I think that's much more about the nature of the internal civil war. I think that's less about the internationalisation of it. It is an anti-fascist war, but it is also a civil war, I would say.
Am I allowed to ask a second? Yes, there may be somebody else.
I can't see it.
I'll sacrifice myself.
I'd say go for it, Peter.
Right, well, on this issue about civil war being a war that we dare not speak its name in Spain, I'm wondering how much of this is to do with the factors you've identified, and how much is it to do with the kind of legacy of the way Francoists presented?
Well, I think it was true at the time. Actually, I think it was true at the time, and possibly even more so than now. I think it's actually in the run-up and during civil wars that you get that real reluctance to use the term, and it then plays out subsequently. But now it's quite stark. You know, someone's talking about the War of Liberation, you know exactly which side they were on.
I just think there was an interesting process after the Civil War
Indeed.
about how you made it.
I'm aware that there's a pillar in front of me, so if someone is hiding behind me with a question, do make yourself known. We have one more?
Just a quick, you referred to the phalangists and something about Rita Hayworth in the 60s, and I didn't quite get what you were on about.
Oh, okay. In the yeah, I like this story. When in the 1930s, the phalangists, there were only about 14 of them, but they go en masse to one of the big cinemas, the one near Opera, where there is a newsreel showing, and they take bottles of ink and they throw the ink at the screen when Stalin comes on, which is of course all premeditated. In the late 1940s, when Gilda is released, and to the horror of Church and Party, actually is past fit for viewing. They do exactly the same thing, but they take bottles of ink and they throw them at Rita Hayworth when she starts singing Maine. It's not. She is not a serious political target.
I think on that note, that's a good. No one's throwing ink at us yet, so that's good. So that basically rounds up for today. Just hold on with me for 2 minutes while I say a number of thanks. Firstly, thanks again to Mary for her lecture and an excellent discussion afterwards. Thanks too to all of our speakers throughout the day, who've given us 8 at least. I've counted their numbers, but I'm sure each of them numerous more. Different ways to think about the Spanish Civil War and stimulate some really fascinating discussions. Thanks to our chairs, Danny and Rosie from the Northern Hispanist Network, and to all of our poster contributors who've really added an extra element to this day, which has been fantastic. Thanks too to all of our sponsors, the Economic History Society, the Royal Historical Society, the Herbert Hughes Trust, the Department of History, the School of Modern Languages and Cultures, and the Arts and Humanities PGR Faculty Forum here at Sheffield for all of their fantastic support. And finally, thanks to all of you lot for coming. You've all been great too.